Imagine this for a second. It's the fall of 2008. In New York, between the skyscrapers, a man in a wrinkled suit steps out of an elevator holding a cardboard box. Inside that box, the mug he kept on his desk, a drawing his child made, and a glossy report stamped with the words, "We know what we're doing," on his face. Just one expression. How is this possible? And that question hasn't left Europe either, for about 18 years now. Because back then, Europe's economy was almost the same weight class as the U.S. economy. Today, the gap isn't a gap anymore. It's closer to a canyon. And Europe is drifting toward the risk of becoming the world's most expensive open-air museum. Beautiful buildings, perfect cafes, orderly cities, but instead of a working engine, a machine sitting behind glass. So what happened? Why couldn't the continent accelerate after 2008? Let's explain it without fancy terms, using a metaphor anyone can feel. Europe used to be a powerful factory ship. Its engine was industry. Its fuel was relatively affordable access to energy. Its crew was a young population. And its course was innovation. Then 2008 hit like a massive hole ripped into the hull. Water started pouring in. It needed repairs. The United States turned on the pumps harder, took risks, backstopped the banks, said, growth, no matter the cost. Europe, meanwhile, tried to pump the water out and hold cost-cutting meetings at the same time. Austerity, fragmented decision-making, endless summits where everyone waited for everyone else. The result? The hole closed late. The ship slowed down. And before the smoke even cleared, Europe sailed straight into a second storm, the design of the euro. One currency, but not one treasury. One central bank, but not one fiscal policy. It's like 27 apartments living in the same building, heating with a single boiler. But everyone pays the bill differently. One leaves the door open, another has a broken window. Think about Jason in Athens between 2009 and 2012. He runs a small business. Taxes rise. Customers disappear. His bank cuts off credit. On TV, they call it a bailout package. But in Jason's real life, there is no bailout. Only wage cuts, unemployment, and hopelessness. Now think about Robert, a civil servant in Germany, being told, "Are we paying for other countries' mistakes?" Suddenly, the crisis stops being financial and turns into an identity fight. Debate gets reduced to Southern Europe versus Northern Europe cliches, and those cliches delay real solutions. Because the truth is colder and more technical. European banks were tangled up with sovereign bonds. When states struggled, banks struggled. When banks struggled, credit froze. When credit froze, the economy shrank. And when the economy shrank, states struggled even more. A perfect doom loop. In the U.S., even if a state gets into trouble, there's a shared federal budget and transfer mechanisms. In Europe, everyone treats their borders, their tax base, and their voters as sacred. The European Central Bank spent years saying, "We can't do that." Then it did, after the fire had already spread. What got lost wasn't just growth. It was time and trust. Lost time is an invisible tax in economics. You pay it back for years. And through the 2000s and 10s, Europe took on another silent tax, a fragmented market. In the U.S., a company can sell the same product across 50 states under broadly similar rules. In Europe, you deal with 27 regulatory regimes, 27 tax systems, 27 consumer frameworks, plus different languages and legal structures. So the wall in front of Emily isn't just compliance paperwork. It's scaling itself. There's also a cultural layer. Europe often treated risk avoidance as a virtue. In many places, bankruptcy isn't learn and restart. It's a social stain. But innovation is basically the sum of controlled failures. That's why Europe has incredible engineering, but fewer global tech platforms. It has strong research, but fewer giants that turn research into mass products. Meanwhile, U.S. big tech collected rent across the digital world. ads, cloud, software, device ecosystems. Europe became the traffic police on the same digital street. Sometimes you need police. But if you only police the street, someone else opens all the biggest stores. And here's the bitter irony. Europe writes the rules, and the ones who obey them most strictly are often Europeans, while companies with massive scale can treat fines as operating expenses and move on. So even well-intentioned regulation can end up keeping Europe's own players smaller. Now let's do a quick forensic audit. Does Europe have money? Yes, savings are high, but where is that money? In bank deposits, real estate, low-risk instruments, low risk, low return, low dynamism. It's like a neighborhood where everyone keeps gold under the mattress. Safe from thieves, sure, but nobody can open a shop. In the U.S., a bigger share of capital flows into stocks, venture funding, and investment funds. Some fail, some become global giants. Europe's capital shortage often isn't a lack of capital. It's capital that never meets courage and scale. That hesitancy comes partly from regulation, partly from pension structures, partly from how society perceives risk. And then there's bureaucratic friction. In Europe, permits for factories, approvals for power lines, mining licenses, data center builds. These can take years. The right to object matters, but a 10-year objection can become a softer form of economic self-destruction. While the U.S. and China turned speed into a competitive weapon, Europe turned perfection and consensus into its weapon. The problem is, global markets often reward the first movers, not the perfect movers. So after 2008, Europe didn't just face a crisis, it partly missed a shift of era. From industrial to digital, from physical to software, from energy-intensive production to knowledge-intensive production. In platforms, in AI, in chips, Europe often ended up as the consumer. Being a consumer isn't inherently bad. What's bad is losing your production capacity and your ability to scale while you consume. Let me ask it more provocatively. Did Europe slowly remove the industrial engine that financed its welfare model? Then replace it with glossy ethics brochures? That's harsh, I know, but it's where the system sometimes fools itself. Because on one side, you have the social state. On the other side, you don't have enough productivity growth and expansion to fund it. That's why Europe carries a ticking time bomb inside. Slow productivity, an aging population, expensive energy, skittish capital, fragmented innovation, rising geopolitical risk. But the real problem isn't one punch. It's 6 separate wounds that bleed Europe from the inside. Each looks manageable alone. Together, they drop you to the floor. First, the great deindustrialization, especially in Germany. A perfect plan built on the assumption of relatively cheap Russian gas turned into a paper castle once supply shocks hit. Energy bills surged. Energy-hungry sectors like chemicals started gasping for air. Picture Michael. He's an engineer at one of Europe's largest chemical sites in Germany. His father worked in the same industry. So did his grandfather. For Michael, this isn't just a paycheck. It's identity. Then one day the company says, we're cutting or closing some capacity in Europe and shifting a big share of new investment to markets with more favorable costs. Giants like BASF run the numbers and hit the brakes on certain European lines. At the same time, they chase scale with massive investment plans in big markets like China. Now you tell me, if you were in charge, would you compete with higher energy costs, higher taxes, higher compliance burdens? Or would you move part of your production where power is cheaper and the market is larger? This isn't a bad intentions story. It's pure arithmetic. Second, the demographic death spiral. In countries like Italy, fertility rates hover around roughly 1.2, well below replacement. Picture Matthew, a 25-year-old Italian graduate. He has a diploma, but no solid job prospects, because the system is aging. And what does an aging system do? Pension costs rise, Healthcare costs rise. To pay them, taxes rise. When taxes rise, young people have less left, less ability to start a business, buy a home, have children. Fewer children means the system ages even more. That's the spiral. So Matthew eventually says, I'm leaving Berlin, Amsterdam, maybe straight to the U.S. And when the most valuable resource, young talent, leaves the continent, who remains? More retirees, lower productivity, less dynamism. Third, the innovation gap and the tech graveyard. Europe leaned into being a regulation superpower more than a technology superpower. GDPR, AI laws, digital market rules. Regulation isn't evil, but when regulation becomes the strategy, you end up with a painful outcome. Great rules, fewer world-scale products. Picture Emily. She's building an AI-powered healthcare app in Munich. She needs funding. She needs scale. And the first wall she hits is compliance. Pages of procedures, different rules by country, barriers around data. Soon Emily faces two outcomes: sell to a U.S. company or fade out before she ever scales. Europe has too many brilliant ideas with tombstones because the ecosystem that helps them grow before they die, capital, scalable markets, risk appetite, is fragmented. Fourth, capital flight. The average European often keeps savings in bank accounts instead of equities. Money sleeps in the bank instead of running through the economy. And big European firms increasingly chase liquidity and investors by choosing U.S. exchanges, NYSE and NASDAQ, over European ones. Examples like Spotify and BioNTech can cross the Atlantic because the story grows faster there. That's not just a listing choice, it's a confidence vote. Because where capital is cheaper and more abundant, growth is faster. U.S. capital markets, venture culture, and the fail and try again mindset act like a magnet. Europe still often whispers, don't make mistakes, follow procedure. So where would you sleep easier as a founder? Where investors write checks? Or where every step waits for approvals? Fifth, the energy squeeze. In some countries, nuclear phase-out decisions. A green transition that was well-intentioned but sometimes poorly sequenced, and deep dependence on Russian gas created fragility. Then war and crises made the bill much worse. And, in some periods, energy costs in Europe have been discussed as anywhere from 2 to 4 times the levels seen in the U.S. and China. Think about it. You're a factory. Your biggest input is energy. Your competitor in the U.S. produces with cheaper gas and power. China builds scale with state-backed infrastructure. And you're trying to make the same product in Europe while burning much more expensive energy. At some point, that stops being competition. It becomes running uphill with weights. Sixth, the end of the free security era. For decades, Europe could keep defense spending relatively lower thanks to the U.S. security umbrella and America's weight inside NATO, and spend more on social welfare instead. Longer vacations, more generous benefits, bigger public services. Great, but as the world order shifts, the bill for that geopolitical comfort is rising. Now, Europe has to pay more for defense and keep paying the high cost of social democracy with the same tax base. With an aging population, how do you do both? Politicians don't love this question because the answer hurts. Either the welfare state gets redesigned, or defense capacity stays insufficient, or debt balloons. And when debt balloons, markets start asking, how solid is this ship's hull really? So stop and ask, did Europe fall behind because it was lazy, or because the system design kept pulling the brakes? Official narratives usually sell this. Everything is under control. We have rules. We have values. Values matter. But values don't pay the bill alone. What Europe experienced after 2008 was a chronic stress test. Banking unions stayed incomplete. Capital markets never fully unified. Energy policy was managed tactically instead of strategically. Innovation stayed fragmented. and demography kept ringing the alarm. Quietly. Meanwhile, the U.S. went through its own painful transformation. Energy advantage strengthened, digital giants conquered the world, capital flows accelerated, demographic dynamism was supported by immigration. Europe often assumed competition was automatic, something you have, not a project you build. And this isn't financial advice, but here's something like historical advice. Assumptions are the most expensive mistakes. So why does the most expensive open-air museum metaphor sting so much? Because museums are beautiful, but they don't produce. Tourists arrive, take photos, spend money. Meanwhile, locals get squeezed into low-margin services. Rents rise. Young people leave cities. Picture 2035. Paris is stunning. Rome is breathtaking. Barcelona is glowing. But the local family living behind the postcard doesn't have children because the future feels uncertain. Wages don't rise fast enough. Taxes are heavy. Housing is expensive. Could Europe preserve its culture while losing its people and its production base? It sounds dystopian, but the data whispers that direction. Heading toward 2100, shrinking populations in some countries, more retirees per worker, tighter public finances. And that pressure doesn't just shape economics, it shapes politics, populism, polarization, the hunt for a scapegoat. In every crisis, the smartest people in the room will model something and publish reports. But the core issue remains simple. Europe's engine is clogged. And you can't fix an engine by sticking regulatory stickers on the dashboard. Now, it looks like there are two paths. In reality, there are. Path 1, a renaissance. Not a romantic word. An ugly reform package. In energy, pulling every option, including nuclear, out of ideology and back into engineering. Cutting permit times. Turning the single market into a real single market. Unifying capital markets and scaling venture funding, speeding up the bridge between universities, labs, and industry, managing immigration as human capital, not just a burden, building defense with shared scale and shared cost, redesigning the welfare state so it stays sustainable. None of this is easy because every reform disrupts someone's comfort. But comfort isn't growth, and reform isn't a miracle overnight. It's a chain of small but hard decisions. Energy reform isn't just opening or closing plants. It's modernizing grids, expanding storage, measuring approvals in months, building supply security for strategic materials. Tech reform means not fighting 3 different licensing regimes in 3 countries just to sell to a market of roughly 450 million people. It means allowing even a small slice of pension capital to flow into venture. Defense reform means not 27 separate procurement lists, but shared orders that create scale, cutting costs and keeping high-tech industry inside the continent. And yes, immigration reform means not shut the door, but a smart system that plans who arrives and how integration works. So the workforce gets younger. Path 2, museumification. Reforms get delayed. Each country runs its own political cycle to win the next election. Taxes rise with aging. Talent flight accelerates. Industry moves out. Energy stays expensive. Tech companies get sold or die. And one day, Europe doesn't ask, why can't we compete with the US anymore? Because the race is over. Europe only debates the refereeing. Which rule is more ethical? Which regulation is more correct? While the scoreboard stays ruthless. So which one happens? What should Germany do about nuclear policy now? Can countries like Italy actually implement policies that reverse the birth rate collapse? Or will more Matthews keep leaving? Can founders like Emily build unicorns in Europe? Or will every bright idea end up in the shopping cart of America's corporate giants? And most of all, can Europe pay the full bill for defense and welfare at the same time? Write your thoughts in the comments. I really do read them because this isn't just about central banks, Brussels corridors, or experts. It's about your wage, Your rent, your child's future. In 2008, the man walking out with a cardboard box asked, "How is this possible?" In 2026, Europe's question is harsher. If this keeps going, what do we turn into? And if the answer is a museum, remember, museums are quiet, but when a continent goes quiet, history books write it very loudly.